My grandmother bought me a penthouse for my birthday, but my mother tried to take it away to appease her new fiancé. Hello everyone, so I just turned 15 3 days ago and my grandmother gave me a very rare and lovely gift. She handed ownership of her penthouse apartment to me. My grandmother does not reside there. She lives in the suburbs but has owned the apartment for a few years and visits occasionally when she wants to be closer to the city. I was overjoyed because the previous year and a half had been a nightmare for me. First, my father abandoned our family. Even though Dad had always been a workaholic with no time for me or my mother, this still surprised me. My mother didn't even tell me about it until my father quietly walked out of the house over a year ago. Apparently, by the time they told me about it, they had already filed for divorce, and my parents had decided that they couldn't live together any longer because my father was simply too burdened. I don't know what overwhelmed him. He did not even say goodbye to me in person. He texted me one more time after he moved out, telling me to be fine. That was it. I didn't see him after that, and my parents eventually separated. Because our state does not have a significant waiting time, my mother was able to maintain the house and have complete custody of my brother and me. My dad had visiting rights, but he hasn't used them yet, so I'm not sure what's going on. As if that wasn't awful enough, my mother informed me around 2 months ago that she had been dating this guy, let's call him Robert, for about 3 months. They were in love, and she didn't want to waste time because she was getting older, so they got engaged. I barely had time to grasp the fact that my mother was seeing someone new. During the same conversation, she told me she was engaged and that this person would be my stepfather. It was a lot to take in, and I was disappointed since I thought 5 months was insufficient time to learn about her fiancé. But she said I didn't need to worry about it. She introduced me to him 2 weeks later, and he appeared quite closed off and aloof with me. However, he acted completely differently with my brother and was very playful with him. At the time, I assumed it was because my brother was just 4 years old, making it simpler to play with him. But a few weeks later, my mother said something that radically altered my opinion of both of them. My mother asked me to sit down with her 2 weeks ago and told me that the reason she and her fiancé got engaged so quickly was because he had been offered a really wonderful position and was going to accept it. However, in order to do so, they would need to relocate and live outside of the state. They meant to leave me here with my grandmother since my mother did not believe I would want to leave everything behind with them. I told her that if it meant staying with her, I would be willing to move away because I had previously experienced my father walking out on me and did not want to go through the same with my mother. However, she attempted to persuade me that it was a poor choice because my school, friends, and happiness were all present. Nevertheless, I insisted on accompanying her. Eventually, she revealed the true reason. Robert only wanted my younger brother to accompany them because he was still young and could develop a relationship with him. She said I was too old and Robert would never consider me his daughter. He didn't like the idea that I thought 5 months was too soon for them to get engaged, and he felt I was mentally trapped in the past when my parents were still married. My mother believed this as well, which is why she wanted me to stay behind and figure things out for myself. This discovery left me extremely hurt. I expected my mother to support me, not forsake me because Robert wanted her to. I didn't mind living with my grandmother since she's a beautiful person who I adore, but I also adore my mother. I attempted to fight, but it felt meaningless, so I told her I wanted to move in with my grandma right now. Of course, moving out that day was not an option, but within a few days, I had packed and was ready to depart. My mother attempted to tell me that she still loved me, but it seemed like she was only looking out for herself, hoping for a chance at happiness with Robert. I didn't speak to her during my last few days at home, and I didn't say goodbye when I left. The only person I bid goodbye to was my younger brother, who I knew I would miss. Since then I've been living with my grandmother, who has been quite kind and sensitive. For reference, my grandmother is my mother's mother. I had no interaction with my paternal grandparents, and they had no contact with my father. Aside from the long trip to school, life with my grandmother has been very straightforward thus far. She adores me and believes what my mother did was terrible. I keep in touch with my brother by phoning my mother's phone every evening, but we don't talk, it's just to speak with him. My birthday was 3 days ago, and I celebrated it at home. To be fair, I did not organize the party. My grandmother did. She surprised me by bringing some of my closest schoolmates and a few select relatives. I was feeling extremely down after my mother left me off here, but the celebration lifted my spirits. I had been feeling really down since my mother dropped me off. However, after we cut the cake, my grandma revealed the gift she prepared for me, which was a huge surprise. She told me that her lawyer would function as trustee for the property for the time being, but that once I turned 18, I would own everything. That was the finest news I had heard in a long time, and I had no intention of sharing it with my mother. Yesterday, however, I discovered that my mother had been notified about the present, most likely by someone at the party. I'm not sure who it was, and it doesn't matter now. But I was irritated when she called me last evening. She informed me she had heard about the gift from my grandmother, and after meeting with Robert, they had decided he wanted to adopt me if I convinced my grandma to transfer ownership of the property to him. I'm not sure why, but she expected me to be delighted at the news because it meant I could finally join them. But I wasn't pleased at all. I told her that I was not going to do anything like that and that she no longer needed to call me. Then I hung up. A few minutes later, she called me again, but I didn't answer. Then she texted me, and this is what she sent. I'm sorry if you felt horrible because I was trying to play by Robert's rules and live life on his terms, but you must understand that after your father and I separated, he was the only person who truly cared for me. Of course, I had my family's backing, but that was different. He was there for me, both emotionally and financially. You are unaware of it because I have never allowed you to experience it or spoken to you about it because I do not want you to have a negative attitude toward your father. But he's not a really generous man. The settlement and alimony I'm receiving from him are completely inadequate, and the child support is absurdly low. I hope you haven't forgotten that your father, not me, was our family's principal breadwinner. I'm grateful that he left the house to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to pay rent. You are aware that our lifestyle has always been extremely expensive. I never had to be concerned about money when I was with your father, but after he left things changed, and I couldn't let you feel that. Even after working extra shifts, I couldn't match your father's income. When I first started dating Robert, he was the one who supported me and took the initiative. I know he hasn't been very nice to you, but that's because he's been in previous partnerships where children were a source of dispute, eventually leading to a separation. We have to consider his trauma as well. I knew my mother would take excellent care of you, so I felt comfortable leaving you with her. It's not as if I abandoned you. You were living with your grandma, and you knew she would never make you feel alone. I only wish you could consider my happiness. Now that I've arranged for you to join us, I want you to take us up on our offer and do what Robert expects so that we can be together. Your brother misses you greatly. I understand you're angry, but I also know you love me and I love you. Please respond shortly. I love you. That message gave me pause, but the last bit really got to me. She expected me to do everything Robert asked simply because she wanted to. It was stupid, entitled and ineffective. I believed my mother had lost her uniqueness. So while the letter initially comforted me, it gradually left a bitter taste in my mouth. After half an hour I told her that I would not do whatever Robert had asked of me and that she may leave with him and leave me with my grandma as she had planned. I had nothing else to say to her because, frankly, her behavior was disappointing. When I asked my grandmother about it, she said that no matter what happens, she will not transfer title of the land to Robert since she hardly knows him and does not trust him. She was confident that he would simply sell the apartment and leave me with nothing. So in some ways, I'm glad I didn't accept my mother's request. However, my mother would not take no for an answer. This morning, she arrived at my grandmother's house with my brother. Fortunately, I was at school when she stopped by. When I arrived home and spotted her in the living room, my grandmother wasted no time in explaining the reason for my mother's visit. My grandmother informed me that she had come to talk to me in person about the proposition she had made last night, which I had obviously neglected. I explained that I had not ignored anything. I responded to my mother's message and was quite clear about what I wanted. I wanted her to stick to her original plan because I was not going to persuade my grandma to transfer the land to Robert. We didn't trust him. I made my position plain, so I didn't see why she was still puzzled. I was rude and had a strong tone, but can you blame me? Anyway, my mother began crying and stated that she was simply trying to make everyone happy, but no matter how hard she tried, it didn't work. I was upset because she was crying when it should have been me. After all, I was the one being treated poorly by both of my parents. I told her to cut it out, and she had it absolutely backwards. She wasn't trying to make everyone happy. She was just trying to make herself happy and expecting everyone else to go out of their way to accommodate her. Perhaps everyone else was willing to do so, but not me. I had a life ahead of me, and I wasn't going to waste it by racing after her to make sure she was okay. That took her by surprise, and she quickly departed. Later, I noticed she had blocked me and I now feel horrible about what I said. So I'd like to ask, am I a jerk, AITA, for telling my mother that she was selfish and just concerned with her own happiness? Update 1. Hello everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank everyone who commented on my first post. It truly opened my eyes. There are other aspects I hadn't considered previously. It hadn't occurred to me that my mother's relationship with Robert may have existed before the divorce. She may just be telling us about it now because it's simpler and more convenient for her now that the divorce has been finalized, and we'd have no idea. Honestly, I hadn't considered it since I couldn't see my mother as a cheater. But now I'm really not sure. She might be, for all I know. Anyway, it's none of my concern because she's made it clear she doesn't want anything to do with me. The only issue is that I can no longer communicate with my brother and I miss him. He and I always got along well, and I hate to think that he could be Robert's child, as many of you have suggested. I'm trying not to think about it, but now that people are discussing it, it's difficult for me to ignore. I genuinely want to know the truth, but I'm terrified. Since I wrote that post, I've had several lengthy discussions with my grandma about these possibilities. While we haven't been able to reach any conclusions regarding the truth, it's gotten increasingly difficult for us to think of my mother in the same manner. I believe that talking to my father about this would provide us with some insight, but I am not sure if he would want to discuss it with us. My mother paid us a visit 4 days ago, and we haven't spoken to her since. On the first day, she blocked me, and later my grandmother informed me that she had blocked her too. To be honest, it's a little ungrateful of my mother. My grandma has been caring for me without expecting child support because she is self-sufficient. My grandmother cares for me out of sheer compassion and love. I can't picture somebody giving up their retirement to care for their grandchildren, but that's precisely what my grandmother is doing. I believe my mother should have been grateful, but instead she blocked her. There are so many things I'm angry about with my mother, and I still have so many unanswered questions. I'm simply hoping that everything will come out in the open. Update 2. Hello everyone. So this is going to be a long update because my father paid me a visit this evening. Apparently, my grandma had called him, but she hadn't told me since she wasn't sure whether he would come and didn't want to raise my expectations. Anyway, he did pay a visit, and as soon as he learned that my mother was engaged to Robert, there were a lot of revelations, which I'm still processing, but I'll attempt to discuss them here. I was astonished to see him, and even more surprised when he hugged me and apologized for everything. He eventually sat down with me and my grandmother and told us everything he knew. He informed me that he and my mother had fallen out of love a long time ago, but they stayed together for my happiness because they didn't want to split up the family and put me through the pain of growing up in a broken house. Then around 3 years ago, my father began an affair with a coworker. He wanted to inform my mother about it but lacked the confidence to do so. She discovered out on her own approximately a year ago and filed for divorce. She promised him she would keep quiet about it as long as he stayed away from us. She laid forth a number of requirements, including leaving the house fully to her, giving her full custody and promising not to visit us until she gave her permission. She also requested a large payout, alimony, and child support, and he agreed to all of them. The only thing he requested in exchange was that she keep his affair a secret and never tell me, as he didn't want me to despise him or regard him as a cheater. So far, she has upheld her half of the bargain, but at the expense of my connection with him. He also apologized for always being a workaholic and not doing more to foster a relationship with me. In his defense, my mother always demanded more, so Dad was compelled to work all the time. He couldn't afford the lifestyle she craved unless he worked around the clock. He told me it wasn't an excuse, but he wanted me to understand that it wasn't all his fault. I understand, yet it is still tough for me to accept. Anyway, he explained why he broke his pledge to my mother and came to see me without first asking her. In the note she left for him, my grandma mentioned Robert's name and inquired if my father knew him. This is why he raced over. Apparently, he knew not just Robert, but also what kind of guy he was. He arrived to warn us about him. My mother, father, and Robert were all in the same social group in college. My parents had been together, but Robert had a crush on my mother. They had all gone out drinking the night before graduation, and Robert told my mother about his sentiments. My mother was with my father at the time, so she turned down his advances, but she didn't inform him until 2 weeks later. Then she informed him she was unsure about her feelings, so they took a break. My father informed me that they had been on break for over 2 months. In the meantime, some people informed him that my mother had gone on a date with Robert, but it did not go well, and she eventually returned to my father. After they reconciled, my father informed her that he did not want her to talk with Robert again since it made him uncomfortable, and she agreed for a while. However, later that year, he discovered she hadn't cut him off, resulting in a massive confrontation. They almost split up, but after the fight, Robert went to my father's place and they got into a violent altercation. Robert felt it would impress my mother, but she was upset with him for being violent, especially because she had already informed him she only wanted to be friends. She eventually cut him off. My father informed me that Robert was constantly out of control and never did anything decent. After my mother cut him off after graduation, Robert moved away and no one heard from him for years. Now my father believes my mother and Robert reconnected a few years ago when she claimed hearing from some acquaintances that Robert was back in town. He wasn't sure when my mother began conversing with Robert again, but if they were engaged, it meant she had been cheating on him, nullifying all of the conditions she had established during the divorce. My father informed me he was going to confront my mother, but first I wanted to speak with her and figure out what was going on. He agreed to wait until I spoke with her. I'm still trying to digest everything. It's complicated in my thoughts since I'm not sure who to believe. My parents haven't been particularly nice to me and things are simply a disaster. Update 3, I finally spoke with my mother. I didn't tell her about my conversation with my father because I wanted to speak with her separately and see what she had to say. She had blocked me, so I had no choice but to pay her a surprise visit. My father paid me a visit 3 days ago and I finally got up the guts to talk to my mother yesterday. She was shocked to see me at the door, but nevertheless allowed me in. Fortunately, Robert was not home, so I could speak freely. I originally apologized to her, but only to get her to open up. I evaded the question for a time, telling her that it was difficult for me to accept Robert into our family so quickly, which is why I had been behaving out. Then I got down to business. I suggested that it didn't make sense that she meet someone as wonderful as Robert so soon after her divorce. It looked overly convenient. I hoped this would force her to admit to knowing Robert from her college days, but she didn't. She merely told me she was fortunate to have found him, and that was it. I knew my father was speaking the truth about their friendship in college because he had pictures. The only thing I questioned was the veracity of the narrative my father told about the three of them. But when my mother flatly denied ever knowing Robert, I knew who to trust. My mother then made matters worse by admitting that she had rushed into the engagement with Robert in order to forget about my father and everything associated with him. That's when Mom told me about my father's affair, which she made him sacrifice everything for and vowed not to tell me about. At that point, I saw no reason to continue the discussion. I said I'd see her later and went. As soon as I got out of there, I contacted my father and told him he could do whatever he wanted since I now knew the truth. I knew my father had not lied about anything. My mother is about to face karma. I'm not saying my father is suddenly innocent, but he's not as evil as my mother. Update 4. Hello everyone, I have a lot to tell you about. First, everyone was anxious about whether my brother was my father's child or not. I was too. Last month, after my father confronted my mother, they had a paternity test done. Thankfully, my brother is indeed my father's child. My father is currently battling for full custody. Since I'm 15, I may state that I want him to have complete custody, and the court will consider that. However, I am still living with my grandmother. Despite my father's efforts, there are still numerous difficulties that need to be addressed. Until then, I'd prefer to live with my grandmother because I'm always confident in her. My mother was upset when she discovered that my visit was just to seek the truth about her and Robert. She unblocked me once, just to curse me out and then block me again. We have not spoken since. Robert dumped my mother as soon as they got engaged. He vanished after learning that my father was attempting to cut his alimony and child support payments. Apparently, Robert had been lying to my mother all along. There was never any job offer. He intended to join his uncle's failing firm and use my mother's money to support it. That's why he asked me to persuade my grandmother to transfer the land to him. They'd been dating for 2 years, and he'd kept her on the hook the whole time. My mother was duped, and instead of being embarrassed, she has been spreading rumors about Robert to all of her acquaintances. What she doesn't realize is that her friends have been gossiping about her, and that is how my father and I found out about everything. I'm just grateful that my mother decided she didn't want anything to do with me the moment Robert pronounced the word. I would hate to be trapped with her right now. Anyway, my father and I have agreed to work on our relationship, and he has pledged to be a better father moving forward. Once he has full or shared custody of my brother, we'll endeavor to be a happy, functioning family. I'm not sure about the functional aspect, but we can at least strive to be joyful.
Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.